Hi, my sweet friends, and welcome back to Crochet Every Day with Judy. We're reading again from Robinson Crusoe, this time starting with Chapter 7, Making a Country Home. Since I had now made my dwelling perfectly secure as I thought, I had a great desire to make a more complete investigation of the island, and to see what other productions I might find which I yet knew nothing of. Excuse me. It was on the 15th of July that I began to take a more particular survey of the island itself. I went up the creek first, where, as I have said, I brought my rafts on shore. I found after I came about 2 miles up that the tide did not flow any higher, and that it was no more than a little brook of running water, very fresh and good. This was the dry season, and there was hardly any water in some parts of it, at least not enough to run in any stream so it could be perceived. On the banks of this brook I found many pleasant meadows, plain, smooth, and covered with grass. On the rising parts of them, next to the higher grounds, where the water, as it might be supposed, never overflowed, I found a great deal of tobacco, green and growing to a great and very strong stalk. There were many other plants which I had no notion of or understanding about. They might perhaps have had virtues of their own, but I could not find out. I searched for the cassava root, which the Indians in all that climate make their bread of, but I could not find any. I saw large plants of aloes, but did not then understand them. I saw several sugar canes, but wild and for want of cultivation imperfect. I contented myself with these discoveries for this time, and came back musing with myself what course I might take to know the virtue and goodness of any of the fruits or plants which I should discover, but I could come to no conclusion. I had made so little observation while I was in the Brazils that I knew little of the plants of the field, at least very little that might serve me to any purpose now in my distress. The next day, the 16th, I went up the same way again, and after going something farther, I found that the brook and the meadows began to cease, and the country became more woody. In this part I found different fruits, and particularly I found melons upon the ground in great abundance, and grapes upon the trees. The vines had spread indeed over the trees, and the clusters of grapes were just now in their prime, very ripe and rich. This was a surprising discovery, and I was exceedingly glad of them, but I was afraid to eat many of them. I found an excellent use for these grapes, however. That was to cure or dry them in the sun, and keep them as dried grapes or raisins are kept, which I thought would be, as indeed they were, as wholesome and as agreeable to eat when no grapes might be had. I spent all that evening there, and did not go back to my dwelling, which, by the way, was the first night, as I might say, that I had slept away from home. In the night I followed my first contrivance, and got up into a tree where I slept well. The next morning I proceeded upon my discovery, traveling nearly 4 miles, as I might judge by the length of the valley, keeping still due north, with a ridge of hills on the south and north side of me. At the end of this walk I came to an opening where the country seemed to descend to the west. A little spring of fresh water, which issued out of the side of the hill by me, ran the other way, that is, due east. The country appeared so fresh, so green, so flourishing, everything being in a constant verdure or flourishing of spring, that it looked like a planted garden. I descended a little on the side of that delicious valley, surveying it with a secret kind of pleasure, though mixed with other afflicting thoughts, to think that this was all my own, that I was king and lord of all this country indefeasibly, and had a right of possession. If I could convey it, I might have it in inheritance as completely as any lord of a manor in England. I saw here abundance of coconut trees, orange and lemon and citron trees, but all wild and few bearing any fruit, at least not then. However, the green limes that I gathered were not only pleasant to eat, but very wholesome, and I mixed their juice afterwards with water, which made it cool and refreshing. I found now that I had fruit enough to gather and carry home. I resolved to lay up a store as well of grapes as of limes and lemons, to furnish myself for the wet season which I knew was approaching. In order to do this, I gathered a heap of grapes in one place, and a smaller heap in another place, and a great parcel of limes and lemons in another place. Taking a few of each with me, I traveled homeward, and resolved to come again and bring a bag or sack, or what I could make, to carry the rest home. Accordingly, having spent 3 days in this journey, I came home, so I must now call my tent and my cave, but before I got thither, the grapes were spoiled. The richness of the fruit and the weight of the juice had broken them and bruised them, and they were good for little or nothing. As to the limes, they were good, but I could bring but a few. The next day, being the 19th, I went back, having made 2 small bags to bring home my harvest. But I was surprised, when coming to my heap of grapes, which were so rich and fine when I gathered them, I found them all spread abroad. abroad, trod to pieces and dragged about, some here, some there, and many eaten and devoured. By this I concluded that there were some wild creatures thereabouts which had done this, but what they were I knew not. However, as I found that there was no laying them up on heaps and no carrying them away in a sack, for one way they would be destroyed and the other way they would be crushed with their own weight, I took another course. I gathered a large quantity of the grapes and hung them upon the outer branches of the trees, that they might cure and dry in the sun. As for the limes and lemons, I carried as many back as I could well stand under. When I came home from this journey, I thought with great pleasure of the fruitfulness of that valley, and the pleasantness of the situation, the security from storms on that side of the water, and the wood, and I concluded that I had selected what was by far the worst part of the country for my abode. Upon the whole, I began to consider moving my dwelling, and looking out for a place as safe as where I now was situated if possible, in that pleasant and fruitful part of the island. This thought ran long in my head, and I was exceeding fond of it for some time, the pleasantness of the place tempting me. However, when I came to a nearer view of it, I considered that I was now by the seaside, where it was at least possible that something might happen to my advantage, and that the same ill fate that brought me hither might bring some other unhappy wretches to the same place. Though it was scarcely probable that any such thing should ever happen, yet to enclose myself among the hills and woods in the center of the island was to anticipate my bondage, and to render such an affair not only improbable, but impossible. Therefore, I decided that I ought not by any means to move. However, I was so enamored of this place that I spent much of my time there for the whole remaining part of the month of July, and though upon second thoughts I resolved, as I said above, not to move, yet I built a kind of little bower, and surrounded it at a distance with a strong fence, a double hedge as high as I could reach, well staked and filled between with brushwood. Here I lay very secure, sometimes 2 or 3 nights together, always going over it with a ladder as before. I fancied that now I had my country house and my seacoast house. This work took me up to the beginning of August. I had but newly finished my fence and begun to enjoy my labor when the rains came on and made me stick close to my first dwelling. Though at my country home I had made a tent like the other, with a piece of sail, and spread it very well, yet I had not the shelter of a hill to keep me from storms, nor a cave behind me to retreat into when the rains were heavy. About the beginning of August, as I said, I had finished my bower and begun to enjoy myself. The 3rd of August I found that the grapes I had hung up were perfectly dried, and indeed were excellent sun-dried raisins. I began to take them down from the trees, and it was very fortunate that I did so, for the rains which followed would have spoiled them, and I should have lost the best part of my winter food. I had more than 200 large bunches of them. No sooner had I taken them all down and carried most of them home to my cave than it began to rain. From then, which was the 14th of August, it rained more or less every day till the middle of October, sometimes so violently that I could not stir out of my cave for several days. In this season, I was much surprised with the increase of my family. I had been concerned for the loss of one of my cats who ran away from me, or as I thought, had died, and I heard no more tidings of her till, to my astonishment, she came home about the end of August with 3 kittens. This was the more strange to me because, though I had killed a wild cat, as I called it, with my gun, I thought it was a quite different kind from our European cats. Yet the young cats were the same kind of house breed as the old one. From the 14th of August to the 26th, the rain was incessant, so that I could not stir, and was now very careful not to be much wet. In this confinement, I began to be in need of food, but venturing out twice, I one day killed a goat, and the last day, which was the 26th, found a very large tortoise, which was a treat to me. My food was regulated thus. I ate a bunch of raisins for my breakfast, a piece of the goat's flesh or of the turtle for my dinner, broiled, for to my great misfortune I had no vessel to boil or stew anything in, and 2 or 3 of the turtle's eggs for supper. During this confinement in my cover by the rain, I worked daily 2 or 3 hours at enlarging my cave. By degrees, I worked it on toward one side till I came to the outside of the hill and made a door or way out which came beyond my fence or wall. So I came in and out this way, but I was not perfectly easy at lying so open, for as I had managed myself before, I was in a perfect enclosure, whereas now I thought I lay exposed. Yet I could not perceive that there was any living thing to fear, the biggest creature that I had seen upon the island being a goat. September 30th. I was now come to the unhappy anniversary of my landing. I counted up the notches on my post and found that I had been on shore 365 days. I kept this day as a solemn fast, setting it apart to a religious exercise, prostrating myself on the ground with the most serious humiliation, confessing my sins to God, acknowledging his righteous judgments upon me, and praying to him to have mercy on me through Jesus Christ. I had not tasted the least refreshment for 12 hours, even to the going down of the sun, and I then ate a biscuit and a bunch of grapes and went to bed, finishing the day as I began it. I had all this time observed no Sabbath day, for as at first I had no sense of religion upon my mind, I had after some time omitted to distinguish the weeks by making a longer notch than ordinary for the Sabbath day, and so did not really know what any of the days were. Now, having counted up the days, I found that I had been there a year, so I divided it into weeks, and set apart every seventh day for a Sabbath, though I found at the end of my account I had lost a day or two in my reckoning. A little after this, my ink began to fail me, and so I contented myself to use it more sparingly, and to write down only the most remarkable events of my life without continuing a daily memorandum of other things. The rainy season and the dry season began now to appear regular to me, and I learned to divide them so as to provide for them accordingly. But I bought all my experience before I had it, and this that I am going to relate was one of the most discouraging experiments that I made. I have mentioned that I had saved the few ears of barley and rice which I had so surprisingly found spring up, as I thought, of themselves. I believe that there were about 30 stalks of rice and about 20 of barley. I thought it a proper time to sow it after the rains, the sun being in its southern position. Accordingly, I dug up a piece of ground as well as I could with my wooden spade, and dividing it into two parts, I sowed my grain. But as I was sowing, it casually occurred to my thought that I would not sow it all at first, because I did not know when was the proper time for it. So I sowed about 2/3 of the seeds, leaving about a handful of each. It was a great comfort to me afterwards that I did so, for not one grain of that which I sowed this time came to anything. The dry months followed, and since the earth had no rain after the seed was sown, the seed had no moisture to assist its growth and never came up at all, till the wet season had come again, and then it grew as if it had been newly sown. Finding that my first seed did not grow, which I easily imagined was by the drought, I sought for a moister piece of ground to make another trial in. I dug up a piece of ground near my new bower, and sowed the rest of my seed in February, a little before the vernal equinox. This had the rainy months of March and April to water it, and sprang up very flourishingly and yielded a very good crop. However, since I had only part of the seed left and did not dare to sow all that I had but a small quantity at last, my whole crop not amounting to more than half a peck of each kind. But by this experience I was made master of my business, and knew exactly when the proper season was to sow, and I might expect 2 seed times and 2 harvests every year. While this grain was growing, I made a little discovery which was of use to me afterwards. As soon as the rains were over and the weather began to settle, which was about the month of November, I made a visit up to the country to my bower. I had not been there for some months, but I found all things just as I had left them. The circle or double hedge that I had made was not only firm and entire, but the stakes which I had cut off some trees that grew thereabouts had budded and grown long branches, much as a willow tree usually puts out shoots the first year after it is cut back. I could not tell what tree to call it that these stakes were cut from. I was surprised and yet very well pleased to see the young trees grow. I pruned them and led them to grow as much alike as I could, and it is scarcely credible how beautiful a figure they grew into in 3 years. Though the hedge made a circle of about 25 yards in diameter, yet the trees, for such I might now call them, soon covered it, and it was a complete shade, sufficient to lodge under all the dry season. This made me resolve to cut some more stakes, and make me a hedge like this in a semicircle round the wall of my first dwelling, which I did. Placing the trees or stakes in a double row at about 8 yards distance from my first fence, they grew presently, and were at first a fine cover to my habitation, and afterwards served for a defense also, as I shall observe in its order. I found now that the seasons of the year might generally be divided, not into summer and winter as in Europe, but into the rainy seasons and the dry seasons, which were generally thus: half February, March, half April, rainy, the sun being then on or near the equinox; half April, May, June, July, half August, dry, the sun being then to the north of the line; half August, September, half October, rainy, the sun then being come back; half October, November, December, January, half February, dry, the sun being then to the south of the line. The rainy season sometimes held longer or shorter as the winds happened to blow, but this was the general observation I made. After I had found by experience the ill consequences of being abroad in the rain, I took care to furnish myself with provisions beforehand, that I might not be obliged to go out, and I sat within doors as much as possible during the wet months. In this time I found much employment, and very suitable also to the time, for I found great occasion for many things which I had no way to furnish myself with, but by hard labor and constant application. Particularly, I tried many ways to make myself a basket, but all the twigs I could get for the purpose proved so brittle that they would do nothing. It proved of excellent advantage to me now that when I was a boy, I used to take great delight in standing at a basket maker's in the town where my father lived to see them make their wicker ware. Being, as boys usually are, very anxious to help and a great observer of the way they work those things, and sometimes lending a hand, I had by this means so full knowledge of the methods of it that I wanted nothing but the materials. When it came into my mind that the twigs of that tree from which I had cut my stakes that grew might possibly be as tough as the sallows and willows and osiers in England, I resolved to try. Accordingly, the next day I went to my country house, as I called it, and cutting some of the smaller twigs, I found them to my purpose as much as I could desire. Therefore I came the next time prepared with a hatchet to cut down a quantity which I soon found, for there was a great plenty of them. These I set up to dry within my circle or hedges, and when they were fit for use I carried them to my cave. Here, during the next season, I employed myself in making, as well as I could, a great many baskets, both to carry earth, or to carry or lay up anything as I had occasion. Though I did not finish them very handsomely, yet I made them sufficiently serviceable for my purpose. After that, I took care never to be without them, and as my wicker were decayed, I made more. I made strong, deep baskets to place my grain in, instead of sacks, when I should come to have any quantity of it. Having mastered this difficulty and employed a world of time about it, I bestirred myself to see, if possible, how to supply two wants. I had no vessels to hold anything that was liquid, except two runlets, which were almost full of rum, and some glass bottles, some of the common size, and others which were case bottles, square, for the holding of water and spirits. I had not so much as a pot to boil anything in, except a great kettle, which I saved out of the ship, and which was too big for such uses as I desired for it, namely, to make broth and stew a bit of meat by itself. The second thing I wanted was a tobacco pipe, but it was impossible for me to make one. However, I found a contrivance for that too, at last. I employed myself in planting my second rows of stakes or piles, and in doing this wicker work all the summer or dry season. Then another business took up more time than it could be imagined I could spare. We'll stop there and start next time with Chapter 8. Thank you for listening. Bye-bye.